Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. This is our fourth installment, and today we'll try to conclude at least the overview of Maimonides' life. Next week and onward, we'll go into some of his texts. One of the most famous letters that he wrote, Maimonides wrote many letters. People don't focus that much on his letters, but people consulted with him from all over the world at that time, as far east as Baghdad and as far west as Spain and Morocco, and southern France. Southern France and all other parts of the world that had Jews. People would consult with him on everything, all matters of Jewish law, Jewish practice, Jewish philosophy, Jewish ethics, and he would respond. So we have 3 volumes of his collected letters, and there are probably many more volumes if we had all of them. So the most famous of his letters was the one we discussed in the first class, the one where he addressed the criticism of the Jews who practice Judaism secretly, and they profess to be Muslims publicly to save their lives, and they were condemned by this rabbi who lived outside of that area. And Maimonides defends the people and tells them to keep their Judaism as much as they can, and so on and so forth. That was the letter that actually catapulted him into world fame, that people realized he was a leader. He wasn't just a great scholar. A similar letter was written later on in his life to the Jews of Yemen. Yemen proves now to be a source of problems for Israel, but in those days it was also a problem. The year 1169, this letter was written in response to a query by a Yemenite rabbi, and there were several issues over there. Number one, the leader of the country, although he was not part of the Almohades as far as I know, but he was from a different sect of Islam, but similarly imposed his religion on everyone, and anyone who refused to convert would be subject to being murdered. So Jews didn't know what to do when they had to resist this terrible decree. That was one problem. A second problem dealt with a Jew who converted to Islam, and he began to preach that Muhammad was a divinely sent prophet, alluded to in the Bible, and that Islam was a new divinely revealed religion superseding Judaism. So here the Jews were being challenged by a fellow Jew to embrace Islam. And the third problem was that a man proclaimed himself to be the Messiah. And he was causing problems because the government authorities were not so excited about this crackpot who thought he was the Messiah. So Maimonides had to deal with all these 3 issues, and in doing so, he treats a lot of different subjects. One of them was anti-Semitism, and Maimonides' theory of anti-Semitism was that you were really hating God. But you can't fight God directly, you can't slap him in the face, so you do it to his chosen people. That was the theory of anti-Semitism espoused by Maimonides, and many others have agreed with that. And he speaks about how Jews were subject to 3 forms of persecution, either brute force, or people would try to refute or falsify Judaism, or a combination of both. And he refers to the fact that Christianity and Islam both believed that they superseded Judaism, and Maimonides defended Judaism, that Judaism was not superseded by any other religion. But then he was a master in consoling people. Maimonides was a total person, a total mensch. He wasn't just the brilliant intellect. He had this passionate love for his fellow Jew and for his fellow human beings, as we saw how he treated his patients. And he tells them that you don't have to worry. We were persecuted in the past, and we've overcome all of our problems, and that we will overcome this problem as well. And this is the message, an eternal message that the Jewish people to this day have to bear in mind, because we're seeing the ugly forces of anti-Semitism rear their ugly heads again and again. And we have to be consoled by Maimonides, knowing that we will overcome. he ridicules the notion that the Bible refers to Muhammad. The Bible was written thousands of years before Muhammad, but they come up with a ridiculous thing. I'll just give you one example. God promises Abraham that I will multiply the children, your descendants, b'ma'od me'od. Me'od in Hebrew means very, very much. They will proliferate. So they said, you know what, you falsified it. Originally it wasn't written me'od me'od, it was written Mohammed. And that you falsified it and changed the language. And this is, of course, preposterous and ridiculous. And as far as the self-proclaimed Messiah, Maimonides shows that he couldn't possibly be the Messiah. What has he done to show that he has the qualifications of the Messiah? And I just want to mention parenthetically that Maimonides devotes a lot of his work, in different parts of it, to describing what is the Messiah. How do we know the Messiah is here? What determines the person to be the Messiah? And one of the things he says, that one of the things Messiah, to prove himself, would at least have to perform miracles. Actually, that's the least of what he has to accomplish, but that's one of those things. And this man didn't perform any miracles. He did nothing unusual. He has nothing about him that could possibly qualify him as the Messiah. And his letter achieved its purpose. The Yemenite Jews remained faithful to their religion. They stood firm, more firm than the Jews in Spain and Morocco when they had similar persecutions. And to this day, Yemenite Jews have embraced Maimonides as their greatest source of knowledge and of commitment to Judaism. To this day, and I just want to mention that historically, Maimonides, when he wrote his works, he constantly revised them. We have fragments of his original handwriting, and you can see him crossing out some of the greatest. There's a story told about two authors. One author was very popular, the other was not popular. So they met once, and the one who was not popular says to the one who was popular, "How come your works are more popular than mine?" And he said, "When do you write your works?" He says, "I write my works early in the morning when my mind is clear." "And what about you?" He says, the popular author says, "I write my works at night, and in the morning when my mind is clear, I cross them out." So Maimonides would cross out. He wasn't afraid to cross out. Only arrogant authors will never revise what they've written. But when you keep on growing and you develop more and more knowledge, you'll cross out. And you see this in his we have original facsimile of his handwriting. I have it in one of my editions of Maimonides. Where do they get it from? When Jews have books that can no longer be used, they either bury them or they keep them in a special room in the synagogue called the Geniza, the concealed place where you hide fragments of holy books. Well, there they found fragments of Maimonides' handwriting. So we see how he used to cross out things. But and he said, where did he send his revised editions? He sent it to Yemen. So what happened as a result that all the rest of the scholarly Jewish community had access to Maimonides' original editions. The revised editions only were present in Yemen. And in the last half century, Yemenite scholars have reproduced Maimonides' works, the most revised editions. So Yemen has this very special place in the annals of Jewish history as it pertains to Maimonides in particular. Now, here we come to Maimonides' most controversial work, the Guide of the Perplexed, the Guide for the Perplexed. So many people will say, yes, when I read it, I become very perplexed, because it was written deliberately by Maimonides to not be intelligible to a person for whom it was not written. For whom was it written? It was written actually to one of his students, but by extension it was written to all people like-minded as his student. What was the nature of this student crowd? The student had to be steeped in Aristotelian philosophy, who were rationalists, and also were committed to Judaism. If you were not committed to Judaism, you didn't have any problem. You embraced Aristotelian philosophy, and that was it. If you were steeped in Judaism and you didn't know anything about philosophy, as most Jews living in Germany and in northern France, and in Babylonia. These were not people steeped in philosophy. They had no problems. They accepted, they embraced Judaism on faith. The problem was for people who wanted both, who were steeped in Aristotelian philosophy, but they were loath to give up their commitment to Judaism, to their faith, to their religion. And they had a problem because in their mind, Judaism and logic or Aristotelian philosophy were contradictory. They couldn't be reconciled. So Maimonides realized that the only way he's going to hold on to these people is to write a special book for them to reconcile Judaism and religion in general with philosophy. And he said, if it's not intended for you, you're going to get confused. Because I put in this book deliberately contradictory statements. And I will not divulge my full understanding of a subject in one place. You have to read the whole book. And you have to make sense of the whole book. So it was written deliberately to not become a popular work. And to that extent, he was right, because it didn't become a popular work. Very few people study the Guide for the Perplexed. Even amongst the greatest Judaic scholars, I'd say maybe 10% will have studied the Guide for the Perplexed. 90% will have not studied that. And part of it was because of the opposition, the controversy. But part of it is because they were not troubled by Aristotelian philosophy. I don't know anyone today who's troubled by Aristotelian philosophy's contradiction to Judaism. It's not a problem. There are more problems with people having problems with reconciling religion and science. But that's a separate issue for a separate discussion. So the guide was written and completed in the year 1186, 1190, and it was recognized. Maimonides was then recognized as one of the greatest philosophers of all times, and he became famous even among non-Jews. But it was written in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic, Hebrew letters, but Arabic language. And then there was a demand. At this point, Maimonides became so famous and so influential and so pivotal to Jewish life that there was a demand right away, have it translated into Hebrew so the rabbis who didn't speak Arabic would be able to study it. And within a decade, 2 Hebrew renditions were made. But it became popular amongst non-Jews as well. Some of the greatest non-Jewish philosophers and theologians relied on Maimonides. Thomas Aquinas, for example, is one of the people, Roger Bacon. And many commentaries were written on the Guide for the Perplexed. We know at least of 30, and there were probably many more that were written to comment on the Guide for the Perplexed. So what was his objective? We already discussed his objective, to reconcile faith and observance of Jewish law with philosophy. Now, the Guide for the Perplexed is divided into 3 books, 3 volumes. The first volume is mostly dedicated to a fancy word, anthropomorphism. When you read the Bible, when you read the Torah, and you read descriptions of what God does, it gives you an impression that God is a corporeal, a physical being, that he has hands, he has a face, he gets angry, and he wages war. You have all these, he sits, he stands, all these physical characterizations. And many Jews who were fundamentalists in the sense that they believed in every word of the Torah took those words literally. And Maimonides and philosophers, theologians, couldn't accept that. How could God be physical? And here Maimonides agrees with the philosophers, and he says, absolutely not. God is not physical. He has no physical properties. But all of these terms that are used, for example, if it says God sits, what does God sitting mean? So he explains that sitting means being in a certain position where you are stable. When you stand, you could wobble. When you're sitting, you're secure and stable. So it means that God's presence is stable. That God's presence is very firmly ensconced within the place where he is sitting. And the same thing, he took all these different physical terms and explains them metaphorically, that they cannot be taken literally. And Maimonides went so far that in his Mishnah Torah, which is his work of Jewish law, his encyclopedic work of Jewish law, he says that anyone who believes that God has any physical form in any way is a heretic. And his greatest critic, the Ravid, who we discussed last week, says, I know some people who are better than this author who believe that. They're not heretics, they're just ignorant. Everyone agreed, all the greatest Jewish scholars agreed that Judaism does not believe in a God who has any physical properties. But not only that, Maimonides goes further. You can't describe God in any terms. You can't say God is kind. Okay, if you say God is kind, you're giving him a definition. You're making him into a finite being. What you could say is that God does not have the absence of any traits. If you said God is not kind, you're also giving him a description. You can't describe God. You can only describe God in negative terms, that he's not the absence of something. He's not missing something, but you can't say he has something. You can't say God is an intellect. You could say he's not intellect. Because if you say he doesn't have an intellect, then you're giving him a limit. You're giving him a definition. So that's the first part of the guide, mostly devoted to that subject. The second part of the guide, he deals with prophecy and creation, angels. What does he say about prophecy? What he says about prophecy, he says there are three views about prophecy. One view, which is the religious view, the popular religious view, that God communicates with certain people. It's a certain communication of God with certain people. The philosophers, I don't know which philosophers he's referring to, but the philosophers believed that prophecy is a sophisticated form of intelligence. He says, and his belief, Maimonides, was a fusion of those two. That yes, it's a sophisticated form of intelligence, but God controls it. You can have the highest level of intelligence and not be a prophet because God says, I don't want you to be a prophet. You don't deserve it, for whatever reason, or it's not necessary. Whatever reason God may have, God is in control of it, but prophecy is not a direct communication of God to a person. However, Maimonides acknowledges there's one exception to that rule, and that's with Moses. And he devotes many of his works, he says the same thing, that Moses was qualitatively speaking a different kind of a prophet from any other prophet. For example, any other prophet can only have prophecy when they are in a state of a trance-like state, when they're in a sleep, in a dream. And they get it through an angel, and they can't tolerate the power. That's why if they would get this message, they would just collapse. And it's not a vivid communication, it's a concealed communication. Moses was qualitatively different. Moses would speak to God, as it were, and I have to say as it were, face to face. Of course, God doesn't have a face, but that's the expression used in the Torah. It means a direct communication. So Maimonides was not averse to the idea that God could communicate with people. He just said that's not the way it is with most prophets. That's what he says about prophecy. What he says about angels, he says angels are another way of speaking of forces of nature. When God controls this world, he makes it rain. God makes it rain, but there's a force of nature that causes rain. There's a force of nature that causes snow. There's a force of nature that causes gravity. And every other force of nature. Those are the angels. What is the word angel in Hebrew? Does anyone know?
Malach.
Malach. What does the word really mean? Malach means messenger.
Something.
The forces of nature are God's messengers.
Yeah.
Now, that was a controversial statement because from all other sources it seems that angels are spiritual beings. But it could be Maimonides didn't disagree with that. He just tried to show that even if you don't relate to the spiritual aspect of things, you could still relate to the idea that God has messengers. He functions through his instruments. The instruments are not capable of doing things on their own. It doesn't rain because it rains. It rains because God wants it to rain, so he allows that force of nature to operate. But the most important part of the second volume of the guide is about creation. The very opening verse of Genesis, I'm sure everyone has heard this, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. And the Hebrew word for creating doesn't exist in any other form other than creation of ex nihilo, something out of nothing. The Hebrew word bara means creating something out of absolute nothingness. If there's something there, if there's some minuscule force, if there's a seed, and somehow that seed was the source of creation, then it's not something out of nothing. So Maimonides said that that's the Torah's belief, but Aristotle didn't believe that. Aristotle believed the universe always existed in some form. So Maimonides in this case says, I can't prove creation ex nihilo, something out of nothing, but I could disprove Aristotle. In other words, his proofs were inadequate. So since there's no evidence philosophically that the world always existed, I rely on faith, on the teachings of the Torah, that the world was created something out of nothing. There's no contradiction to it that would pose a problem. That's more or less what he says about creation. What does he do in the third part of the Guide for the Perplexed? The third part, he focuses on Jewish practice, on the 613 commandments that he enumerated and he was in love with in his other works, where he enumerates them many times, 4 or 5 or maybe 6 times. He lists the 613 commandments, and he devotes his most important work, the Mishnah Torah, the 1,000 chapters, to enumerating all the particulars of all those commandments, because every commandment has details. So if you take one commandment, let's say the laws of observing the Sabbath, there are thousands of laws relating to the Sabbath, but it's all one commandment. So Maimonides was steeped in Jewish practice and Jewish law, but in the guide he takes a different approach. He explains the commandments philosophically. He gives reasons for the commandments. And that was a source of a lot of controversy. How could you give reasons to the commandments? A commandment is, as the word itself suggests, that there's a commander, and this commander, you're in the army, your sergeant tells you to stand straight, you stand straight. You don't ask the sergeant, could you tell me why you want me to stand straight? I was never in the army, but I suppose that's what happens. You'll get some type of a punishment if you start asking for questions. So why are you asking, why are you looking for reasons? So Maimonides, nevertheless, ignored that criticism, and he gives reasons for the commandments. But he admits that I can't give reasons for all the commandments. And here's where we can find what people think are contradictions between his Mishnah Torah and the guide. I remember some speaker was talking about Maimonides at Cornell University, and as he's discussing Maimonides' writings, his Mishnah Torah, his guide, one of the professors, a very world-famous philosopher, I think his name was Dr. Black, and he says, I believe that there were 2 Maimonides. It couldn't have been the same person who wrote both. Because when you read the Mishnah Torah, you read the work of a pious person who was devoted to serving God to the minutest detail, and who didn't care for the reasons. He would emphasize that these are God's commandments and we do them even if we don't know the reason. In fact, in one place, Maimonides writes, in his Mishnah Torah, he writes that there are 2 kinds of commandments. There are commandments in Hebrew that are called mishpatim, judgments, like thou shalt not steal, don't commit murder. These are civil laws that make sense. And then there are laws that are called chukim, which translates as statutes, but the real meaning is laws that are etched in stone. And you do them because you were told to do them, you were commanded to do them. And he says you should do those with the same enthusiasm as you do the ones that make sense, that you have reasons for. So in the Mishnah Torah, he acknowledges that much of Judaism For example, the laws of keeping kosher, he includes in that category. You can't mix milk and meat. In his Mishnah Torah, he says that's a law that doesn't have a reason. In his Guide for the Perplexed, he gives a reason for it. I'll soon share the reason that he gives for not mixing milk and meat. But I'm just trying to point out what seems to be a contradiction. In the Mishnah Torah, he focuses on the fact that we observe the commandments because God said so. And we don't have to look for reasons, and there's no need for the reasons. And in the Guide for the Perplexed, he gives reasons for many of the commandments. So some people look at that as, well, he changed his mind. You can change your mind. But Maimonides would not have changed his mind without acknowledging that in his earlier life he had the opposite view. Maimonides was so consistent, and it was so attempting to be consistent, and where he changed, and he did change some of his views, he acknowledges that. So the most rational explanation for the changes between the Mishnah Torah and the Guide in this respect is his audience. Have you ever had a teacher who speaks to two different audiences different ways? Absolutely. When you're talking to an adult audience, you say things in a certain way. When you speak to a juvenile audience, you change the way you describe things. You say things in a simpler way. You have different audiences, different education, different level of receptivity. You're going to change the way you present things. In the Mishnah Torah, he was addressing the average person, man, woman, and child. And he writes in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, this book was written, katan v'gadol. Katan is small. Small can mean young, it can mean uneducated, and big can mean, chronologically speaking, an older person or a more sophisticated person. I've written it for everyone. So it has to be on a level that everyone could appreciate it. That's the audience of the Mishnah Torah. The Guide for the Perplexed, the audience was for a very minute segment of the community, only those who were steeped in both Judaism and philosophy and found them to be troubling inconsistencies between them. At least in their mind they were troubling, and he had to show Judaism could appeal even to someone who bases his life on rationality. So when he's talking in the Mishnah Torah, he focuses on commandments as being not rational. Many of them are not rational. They don't have to be rational. We do them because God said so. When he's talking to a philosopher, he focuses on the rationality. He's trying to show Judaism does have a rational basis for it, and you could explain many of the things rationally. Now, one of the things that seems to be his pet rationality for commandments, and this demonstrates Maimonides' penchant and his obsession his whole life, was being an iconoclast, destroying idols, destroying idolatrous beliefs. And what does he do? He says, you know why we can't eat milk and meat? Because the ancient pagans would cook a kid in the milk of its mother as a way of worshiping their deities, their pagan deities. Why is it that the Torah says you cannot wear a garment mixed with wool and linen? That's one of the 613 commandments. In the Mishnah Torah, it's a commandment without a reason. God said so. We don't understand why. Wool and linen, you could wear wool and cotton, you could wear linen and rayon, but you can't wear wool and linen. There's no reason for it. In the Guide for the Perplexed, he says, yes, there's a reason. Because the pagan priests would wear that kind of a garment. That was their type of garment. And he explains many of the commandments as ways of repudiating idolatry. And in doing so, he also rejects the whole notion and the whole belief in magic, in astrology, in demonology. And it's interesting, just as another aside, Maimonides says there's no such thing as demons. Demons are a metaphor. There's no real thing, creatures called demons. Most other rabbis disagreed with him about that. But there was a 18th century rabbi who says, Maimonides was influenced by Greek philosophy, and that's what turned him off the right path. So I saw an author not too long ago, professor in New York, who says he did research, and all the Greek philosophers believed in demons. So Maimonides deviated from the Greek philosophers. He was not orthodox in the sense that he embraced Aristotle. He had the highest regard for Aristotle, more than any other philosopher in history, but he didn't think Aristotle was perfect, and he deviated from him. So Maimonides, in his third part of the guide, focuses on the commandments. Here's another discrepancy between what he writes in the Mishnah Torah and in the guide: sacrifices. Why does the Torah command us to bring sacrifices, animal sacrifices? In the Mishnah Torah, he says it's a chok. It's a commandment that has no reason. The reasons were not revealed to us. It's God's commandment to us. In the guide for the perplexed, he gives a reason. The reason he gives is that when the Jews came out of Egypt, they were steeped in idolatry. And what did idol worshippers do all the time? Bring sacrifices. So God said, if I'm going to tell the people no more sacrifices, they're so entrenched in it, it's so much part of their way of life, they're not going to listen. So I'm going to tell them, you want sacrifices? Bring sacrifices. Just bring them to one God, not to all these pagan gods. So it was a way of weaning people off idolatry. So Maimonides, again, focuses on idolatry and negating it. So the question is asked. In the Mishnah Torah, he says it has no reason. Here he says it has a reason. Now the truth is, both statements that it has no reason and the reason he gives are mentioned in earlier works. It's not Maimonides' own invention. So he wasn't deviating from the tradition. What he was doing is, if you're a philosopher, here's a reason. If you're not troubled by philosophy, if you're not a rationalist, then you don't have to worry. You don't have to have reasons for everything, because even the most rational person will have to admit there are certain things that are above rationality. Now, Maimonides, another controversial subject was miracles. Maimonides, it seemed, from some of his writings, before the guide actually, and even in the guide, that believed that miracles were all part of a natural world, that God programmed the miracle in nature. And people misunderstand that to mean that he didn't believe that God has the power to change nature. He had that belief for sure, because one of the arguments against this false Messiah was he didn't perform miracles. Well, if he didn't believe in miracles, why would he have to perform miracles? Maimonides also wrote a letter to defend his belief in the resurrection of the dead, that in the Messianic age, the dead literally be brought back to life. Maimonides took that very literally, that belief, and he considered that to be one of the 13 principles of faith. To bring dead back to life, as far as I can tell, is not a natural phenomenon. It's a miracle. So he believed in miracles, but he also believed that God cherishes nature, that nature is not some hostile force that God has to do battle with. Nature is God's handiwork. It's like a piece of art. You have a Rembrandt, and someone wants to do something, make it, put a little more color in it. It's not enough color in the Rembrandt. I want to embellish it. Why do you want to embellish it? It's beautiful. It's a piece of art. Well, to Maimonides, the world is a Rembrandt. It's a piece of art, divine art. Why would God want to mess up his piece of art? Unless there's an absolute need for it, that God could certainly do it, that goes without saying, but otherwise, he believed that God programmed the miracles in nature. At the time of creation, he programmed that in a certain time, a miracle will happen. And if we have time, I have a little story I can share with you. Is anyone in a rush?
It's okay.
In Spain, I'm sure you're familiar with the Inquisition, that you had to convert to Catholicism, and if you were found practicing another religion, you would be put to death. And there was a Jew who converted to Christianity publicly, but secretly he practiced Judaism. And this is in the 18th century, the 1700s. And he was discovered, and they sentenced him to death. But he was a close advisor of the king. So the king pleaded with the Inquisition, give him a year at least to live, another year. So they postponed it a year. Then the year comes to an end. The king says, could you give it another month? Another year. They said, no. Another month? Yes. Month was over. Could you give him another month? No. Another week? Okay. Another week? No. Another day? Okay. And finally the day came and they would not postpone it, and they tied him up to the stake and ready to start the execution, and there was an earthquake. And everyone escaped, and he escaped, and he left Spain. And he thought to himself, was that a miracle? If it's a miracle, then I'm going to proclaim my Judaism openly. I'm not going to play this game with the publicly I'm this and privately I'm something else. But if it can't be proven to me that it was a miracle, I'll continue the way I'm living till now. So he went from philosopher to theologian to rabbi, and he traveled all around Europe. And no one could convince him it was a miracle. He wasn't convinced. So he went to the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. And the Baal Shem Tov sent him to a student of his, whose name was Rabbi Wolf Kitzis. And Rabbi Wolf Kitzis says, you're looking in the wrong direction. That earthquake was programmed at the beginning of creation, that it had to happen at that time and in that place. It wasn't for you. The miracle was that they postponed your sentence by a year, and then a month, and a week, and then a day. If they had been postponed 2 years, you would have been dead. The miracle is not the earthquake, the miracle is the confluence of events. And that's essentially what Maimonides is saying, that yes, there are miracles, but the miracles are how we benefit from the things that God programmed into nature. Maimonides passed away in the year 1204, 83 days short of his 70th birthday. In the city, he's buried in the city of Tiberias. 83 days short of his 70th birthday. Remember, I mentioned that the Mishnah Torah, he divided into 14 volumes and 83 subsections. He liked the number 83, and I also mentioned last week that the Hebrew word for illness adds up to 83. So it has been suggested that he lived to the age of 70, and the fact that he was missing 83 days, those 83 chapters or subsections of the Mishnah Torah made up for the full 70 years. Why was he buried in Tiberias? There's a story, I don't know if it's a true story or not. Some say that's where his father was buried. It makes sense to bury next to the father, but there's another story attached to it, that as they were taking his body to be buried in Israel, he didn't say where he wants to be buried, just in Israel. There was a whole procession carrying his coffin on a wagon, and people were following. Bandits thought they were transporting some treasure. They didn't realize it was a treasure, but a different kind. And everyone fled, and they opened the coffin, and they saw a body, so they just left it. And the horses kept on taking it all the way to Tiberias, and it stopped in Tiberias, and that's where he was buried. Whether that story is true or not, I don't know, but there's something significant about Tiberias. Maimonides writes in his works, codifying what it says in earlier sources, that the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of Israel, that was responsible for all of the 613 commandments, was housed in the temple in Jerusalem. But as a result of the destruction of the temple, the Sanhedrin was exiled. It went through 10 different moves, and it ended up in Tiberias. And when Mashiach comes, when the Messiah comes, the Sanhedrin will be reconstituted in Tiberias. Maimonides had a certain affinity for the idea of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the collective body of Jewish law, and Maimonides was the collective work of Jewish law. No one, as I mentioned last week, no author before him or after him ever tried to put together in one book a collection of everything there is to know about Jewish law, about all the 613 commandments. So he was the Sanhedrin in terms of his book. And he had some type of affinity for the Sanhedrin. I'm not going to go through all the controversies. We have a list of all his controversies. I made a list of 14 of them. I didn't plan to make 14, it just came out that way, but 14 was Maimonides' favorite number. But Maimonides today, first of all, no one ever impugned his ethics and his piety. What they impugned was his philosophy, his theology, the way he wrote his works. Today, every segment of Judaism, whether you're Sephardic, Ashkenazic, you're a rationalist, you're a Kabbalist, you're more spiritual, less spiritual, Everyone embraces Maimonides as one of the greatest teachers, scholars, and leaders of the Jewish people in the last 2,000 years. No one disagrees with that anymore. However, not everything he did has become popularized. The Guide for the Perplexed has not become popularized. The criticism of it has remained. It's not the best book to read if you want to know more about Judaism and about Jewish life. Read the Mishnah Torah, don't read the Guide. Guide only if you're a scholar and you have nothing else to do with your life. You read the Guide, but it's not so popular. He didn't want to popularize it, so it's not as if he tried to do it and it was rejected. It was rejected, but that's not the reason why people don't study it. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, the great Jewish leader, instituted a program of studying Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, studying 3 chapters every day. So if there were 1,000 chapters, do the math, at a little less than a year, you can go through the entire Mishnah Torah. It's a monumental undertaking, and for those who can't do 3 chapters, he suggests to do 1 chapter so you finish it in 3 years. But that's how far the admiration of Maimonides and his work has gone. Was Maimonides a rationalist? Yes and no. He was not a pure rationalist. He had tremendous amount of faith. He believed that God is real and that God will do all the things that the Torah says that he will do. And the ultimate thing will be the bringing of the Messiah. And he wasn't really out to make Judaism rational. He wanted to make it accessible to everyone. That's why he wrote his works. He wrote his works initially for himself, to make it accessible to himself, but he really wrote his works after he realized how popular they became, to help people, to restore things that people didn't know, the 13 principles of faith, the Mishnah Torah, the knowledge of all the 613 commandments. And also he wanted to make it accessible to rationalists. So he presented the rational side of Judaism. Many times he's referred to as the great eagle, because the eagle has a panoramic view of everything. And that's how Maimonides saw everything. He saw the whole view. He didn't see just little particulars here or there. Many other scholars would focus on Judaism piece by piece. But he looked at the totality. And that's really what, if I had to find one word to describe Maimonides, one of those words, there are several words I would use, but one of those words would be totality. He was focused on the totality of Judaism. Any questions?
See, the book, the stuff, the rest, and all of that, you're not to it all as questions?
No questions.
We're perplexed.
This is, yes, one class where you come out perplexed. It means that the speaker succeeded. So next week, God willing, we'll start a section of his Mishnah Torah, which is called Hilchot Deot, the laws of proper dispositions, is one way of translating it, of attitudes, where he talks about the ethics of Judaism and presents it in his own original way. So we'll start with that text, and we'll do some of that text, and then we can always, yes?
I have a question.
Oh, thank God.
On the controversies, number 5, remuneration for rabbis, the Maimonides' view did not prevail. What was his?
His view was rabbis are not allowed to get paid for their rabbinic services. Because they're doing, God, when he gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai, he didn't charge.
So then how do they support their families?
Oh, that's why Maimonides was a businessman. He was a partner, a silent partner of his brother who dealt with diamonds, a diamond merchant. And when his brother drowned in a shipwreck in the Indian Ocean, he turned to medicine and he became a doctor.
Oh, I see.
And that occupied so much of his time that we don't even know how he was able to be so prolific. I mean, he wrote the commentary on the Mishnah, which is a multi-volume work. He wrote a commentary on the Talmud. We only have fragments of it. He abridged the Jerusalem Talmud. We only have fragments of it. He wrote a treatise on logic. He wrote a commentary, the Book of Commandments, a major work, 2-volume work. The Mishnah Torah, 14 volumes. The Guide for the Perplexed, 3 volumes, and his letters, we have at least 3 volumes of letters, and there's probably much more that he wrote. And he wrote about 10 medical works. And he was a full-time doctor, and he had no time for people. He was just treating his patients all day and night. So when did he do all this? It's a mystery.
Well,
Some of it he did before he became popular as a doctor, and some of it he did probably the later years when he probably semi-retired, I assume. But he accomplished more than most other people could accomplish in 10 lifetimes. Yes.
Did he ever function as a rabbi?
Yes.
Did he?
Oh, yes. He was the leading rabbi in Cairo, Fastad, and then he became the accepted rabbi of all of Egypt, and then of Yemen. The Yemenite Jews, after this incident happened, turned to him for everything they needed. They had their own rabbis, but their own rabbis turned to him. So he became, and that's why to this day, as I mentioned before, Yemenite Jews glorify Maimonides and are attached to him more than any other group of people. For example, when we want to know how to practice a certain commandment, and there are different opinions about it in the Talmud, we don't go to Maimonides for his decision because there are later codes of law that incorporated some of Maimonides and other writings. Maimonides is one of 3 major sources of Jewish law, but he's not the exclusive authority. In Yemen, he's the exclusive authority to this day. Now, there are no Jews in Yemen, but the Yemenite Jews who live in Israel, they consider Maimonides to be their rabbi to this day, even though there are over 800 years that separate between us and him.
Yeah, people do consider him as a rabbi, but he did any work as a rabbi.
Yes. He had a synagogue, he taught people, he answered their questions, he represented them to the government. A rabbi is essentially a teacher and a judge. He teaches his congregants, and he judges them matters of Jewish law. He's the judge. He's the authority that determines how their mode of behavior. So he did everything rabbis did, but he said, I can't get paid for it. Thank God, as a rabbi, I have to say that Maimonides' view did not prevail. We follow the majority. Torah says you go by the majority. The majority of rabbis said no, rabbis could charge, because if they didn't spend time being rabbis, they would probably become doctors or lawyers. So you have to pay them for their time. And a simpler explanation is that most rabbis can't do what Maimonides did to earn a living. They have no choice. Okay. Thank you very much.